In the course of just a decade and a half of life, Sigmar Heldenhammer ascended beyond the status of a mere unburigan tribal prince to both unify and bring salvation to the realms of mankind. When the merciless tides of history thought to snuff humanity from the world, he stood in their way and blocked their path time after time, ultimately defeating the greatest greenskin war in history at the Great Battle of Blackfire Pass. However, these were only the first steps in Sigmar's grand ambition of leading mankind to strength and prosperity, and a threat even more nightmarish than the savage greenskins bore down on the Empire, provoked partly by Sigmar himself. Welcome to the Wizards and Warriors channel. Enjoy our final video on the life of Sigmar Heldenhammer and his war against the Supreme Lord of Undeath, Nagash. All fantasy worlds are packed with inspiration from those that came before, and one source that inspired both this channel and the fiction writing scene in general was Frankenstein, now celebrated at our sponsor Magellan TV. They bring you the strange life of Dr. Frankenstein, a look back at the early science fiction masterpiece and the myriad of adaptations it inspired, the power of the modern Frankenstein myth, and a look into how the incredible Mary Shelley worked under immense pressure at a young age to produce the timeless classic. And that's just a slice of the 15 or more hours of 4K high-definition content added every week for their subscribers at no extra cost, covering loads of genres, science, true crime, travel, and especially history. They boast the richest and most varied history content available anywhere. Basically, you'll never run out of things to watch with Magellan TV. It's all viewable anytime, anywhere, on televisions, laptops, mobile devices, and more. Get access to 3,500 hours of ad-free documentaries for only $4.99 a month, and get a month for free by subscribing to Magellan TV via our link in the description. As though the gods of men had rewarded their faithful for destroying the greenskin invaders at Blackfire Pass, the year after that climactic battle proved an auspicious one. The often savage winter months were mild, the summer warm and pleasant. As a result, the crop harvest ranked among the most bountiful in living memory. It was this year, the first of the imperial calendar, that marked Sigmar's formal coronation as emperor. Upon receiving his dwarf-forged crown, Sigmar declared the old title of king to be abolished. No king should be subject to another's rule. Instead, the tribal rulers were declared the counts of the empire, each retaining their lands and rights as sword-oathed vassals in perpetuity to Emperor Sigmar. Reikdorf, ancestral capital of the Emberigan tribe, would serve forever as capital, a beacon of hope and learning where all men, from warriors to scholars, would gather to further the advancement of mankind. Sigmar's foremost bodyguard, Alfgeir, received the title of Grand Knight of the Empire, while shrewd Pendrag was ordered to march north to take up the title Count of Middenheim. This peaceful period did not last long. Soon after his coronation, Sigmar and his companions rode west in response to rumours that the Endel Lord Aldred's lands were afflicted by a malignant sickness. After a period of investigation, the Emperor revealed the Count's advisor to be a chaos worshipper in service to demons of the nearby marsh. He defeated the threat, executed the traitor, and ensured Aldred's loyalty. Uncounted threats still bore down on the Empire. News continuously poured into Reikdorf from the north, warning of Norse raids, perpetrated by forces under a warlord, Cormac Bloodaxe. Assaborn chariot warbands brought tales of ruined villages in the eastern foothills, destroyed by resurgent greenskin bands. In the south, Menegoth lands still suffered under assault from greenskins, trolls, and ratmen, and everywhere did mutated beastmen attack and raid the lands of men. Sigmar assembled the counts to discuss the dangers, and directed their fury at the final recalcitrant tribe, the Gitones of Marius. Unable to stand against the united empire, Marius retreated to his seaboard capital of Jutonsric in year 4 of the imperial calendar and settled in for a siege. Only after 2 more grueling years did Sigmar seize his clifftop fortress, the Namathir, and bend the Teutonic ruler to his will. As ever, Sigmar could not afford to celebrate his victory for very long before a threat in the north demanded the Emperor's attention. In the 6th year of his imperial reign, Count Pendrag sent for aid, and all too happy to see his comrade again, Sigmar trekked up to Middenheim with a force of warriors. On arrival, it became obvious that something was terribly wrong. The Norsi were again growing bold in their raiding, but far worse was the looming dark presence of a nameless horror emanating from the Middle Mountains. Many warriors and Templars were already missing after seeking the evil out, and the situation was becoming serious. In search of this budding nightmare's black heart, Sigmar and his companions ventured into the mountains and eventually came across the imposing Brass Keep. There, the Emperor and his warriors confronted an awakened necromancer known as Morath, remnant of a lost and infamous kingdom of death known as Morkane. The clash against his legions of risen dead proved horrifying, but Sigmar cast the profane sorcerer down and seized from him a mysterious golden jeweled crown possessing incredible power. But as the near-skeletal necromancer faded from life in the Emperor's grip, he is said to have muttered the ominous words, "No, you promised," as if the wretch were speaking to someone only he could see. It was a dire warning Sigmar did not heed. With the new crown on his brow, the Emperor left the Middle Mountains and immediately encountered Odyssey refugees from the north. The news, as ever, proved grim. Norsi marauders and their Rupsmen allies had murdered Sigmar's friend, Count Wulfila, burning his lands and massacring thousands of innocents in the process. Such atrocities could be expected of the chaos-worshipping northern raiders, but Rupsmen participation came across to Sigmar as a grievous betrayal. Motivated by a vicious rage that was only partly his own, the Emperor set out to enact severe punishment. Upon reaching Rupsmen territory, Sigmar fought and won 3 battles against the tribal armies, inflicting devastating casualties. In any other circumstance that would have been enough, but Sigmar refused to relent. What ensued was tantamount to the merciless genocide of an entire people. Villages turned to ashes, prisoners executed, and families murdered without hesitation. Rumors spread that Sigmar could be heard at night crying out in his sleep, as though in the grip of an infinite nightmare. Sigmar's elite warriors caught their monarch whispering nonsensical words under his breath, as though he too was speaking to some unseen presence. He became more paranoid, sadistic, violent, and cynical, a far cry from the idealistic optimist of his younger days, inspiring discontent in the other counts. If Sigmar could perpetrate such acts on one tribe, why not on them? 6 weeks later, the Emperor marched through the gates of his capital, where he was met by Count Kruger. Sigmar took his subordinate to a jail, where he angrily revealed Aloysius. Both men had refused to cease their internecine squabbling when ordered. As punishment, they were both to be executed. But when Sigmar raised his blade to strike the first man, his greatest companion Wulfgar emerged from the mist and confronted him. The 2 men argued, Wulfgar beseeching his friend to see reason. This tyrant was not him. When that didn't work, Wulfgar attacked, and the 2 men fought a brutal struggle in the mire. Eventually, something within Sigmar gave in, and realization struck him. The Emperor ran deeper into the marsh, fighting an internal battle with the destructive magical force within the crown atop his head. This voice offered everything, all the world under Sigmar's benevolent control, his love restored to life and his every ambition fulfilled. The Emperor declined, ripping the crown from his head and dispelling its baleful influence over him. Sigmar sealed the crown away, but its guiding presence had shown him something else in its ensnaring attempt. Wolf ships in their hundreds prowled the northern seas, readying an apocalyptic invasion to try and complete what the Greenskins had started half a decade earlier. In year 6 of the imperial calendar, Cormac Bloodaxe attacked the Empire, inflicting the Emperor's first defeat, but not managing to destroy his army. The war culminated at the Siege of Middenheim, where the Emperor once again confronted the enemy commander, now a demon prince of Khorne, in personal combat, defeating him. As mankind, bloodied and weary, convalesced in the aftermath of the Norse assault, the clock of doom finally struck 12. The catastrophe began in the extreme south, where the dour Menegoths were all but annihilated by an army of the risen dead. Then they too were raised from their early graves, fodder for a new and unflinching army. From this time, affected by malevolent sorcery, corpses within the barrows and crypts of the Central Empire began to awaken and assault the living. The first knowledge Sigmar gained of this new atrocity came in the form of a single Arabian emissary. This man, in truth a millennia-old vampire called Khaled al-Muntasir, came before Sigmar bearing a message from his master, Nagash. When the name was mentioned, a mixture of terror and disbelief spread throughout the hall. To Sigmar's 12 tribes, Nagash was little more than an evil legend, a story told by mothers as a warning to their children at bedtime. But the ancient necromancer king was indeed real. He desired one thing above all, his crown of sorcery. Sigmar declined. To grant this monster his wish would damn the entire world. And just like that, the war against the dead began. Engorged by the masses of the Menegoth dead, and aided by the newly made vampire Count Marcus, Nagash's corpse army surged north into Burgundian territory with absolutely nothing capable of standing in its way. The sorcerer's undead legions first scoured the land, then descended on a thoroughly unprepared Sigurdheim. Of the city's population, numbering almost 8,000, only 12 survived to carry news of this north. Among the casualties was Count Sigurd, who followed Marcus's fate and was transformed into a vampire. At the same time, Nagash's armies had managed to surround and isolate the various strongholds of the Merregans to the southwest. They held on, a few shimmering specks of light drowning in a sea of darkness, but they held on. As Nagash prepared to advance on Reikdorf and secure his ancient crown, he unleashed a deadly pincer assault designed to tie down Imperial forces and stop them from coming to the Emperor's defense. In the Imperial territories of the north, risen dead gradually coalesced into titanic hordes that blockaded Middenheim and Talheim, cutting the cities off and preventing their warriors from marching to Sigmar's aid. In the west, a flotilla of several hundred warships assaulted Jutonsrik and scoured Marius's recently subjugated mercantile capital of all life. The Count managed to withdraw east with a small number of refugees and warriors, in the hope of gaining asylum with Endel Chief Uldred. The dead were not far behind, and quickly besieged Marburg, which resisted fiercely. To the far northeast, the semi-nomadic Ostrogoths fought a hit-and-run war against the dead armies. Finally, at Nagash's command, Khaled al-Muntasir led a force of several thousand cadaverous warriors and beasts north to confront the ferocious Assaborns. Not only would this deprive Sigmar of yet another vital ally, but a wave of terrified innocents would be driven toward Reikdorf, causing chaos. The vampire general was successful at first, defeating and absorbing Queen Freya's force near the River Aver, but the fiery warrior managed to escape. He then drove directly at the Assaborn capital of Three Hills, where Freya's right hand, Mabe, together with a Dwarven contingent, fought a desperate last stand, outnumbered 8-1. Defeat was imminent until Sigmar, Wulfgart, and a large force of Imperial reinforcements arrived, taking al-Muntasir completely by surprise. As he tended to do, the Emperor went straight for the lead vampire, but the Blood Drinker fled the field and rode south to rejoin his lord. The small undead force was completely destroyed, and the victorious army of mankind returned to the Imperial capital, ready to defend against Nagash. With his crushing multitudes swollen by Imperial dead, numbering into the tens of thousands, the millennia-old Nehekaran sorcerer lord finally bore down on Reikdorf in the year 15 Imperial calendar. His army halted outside the walls, willing to grant Sigmar one final, generous chance at undying glory. Loath to treat with such lesser beings himself, Nagash sent Khaled al-Muntasir, together with both Marcus and Sigurd, to secure the crown of sorcery without need for a battle. Basking in Sigmar's horror at the fate of his now vampiric comrades, Muntasir gave him a choice. Reikdorf and every man, woman and child in it would die no matter what, but they could either choose to concede and be reborn in glory, or be resurrected as maddened creatures of unending hunger and torment, only after ravening corpse-eater beasts had defiled and mutilated their cadavers. "Tough choice," Wulfgar said sarcastically. "Can we think about it?" Humour being anathema to him, Khaled simply declared that they had until the moons rose to decide, and rode off. That night, Sigmar, the warriors at his disposal, and the civilian population of the imperial capital emerged from the ruined Ostgate onto the hard-packed flat ground between two forks of the River Reik, terrain suitable for cavalry attacks. The Emperor and his Great Hall Guard cavalry manned the centre right, while his prime bodyguard Alfgeir commanded the White Wolves on the centre left. Flanking both cavalry divisions were units of heavily armed Unberigan infantry, armed with spears and shields. Sigmar's right flank, anchored on the southern fork of the Reich, was manned by a paltry dozen Assaborn chariots led by Queen Freya, her bodyguard the Queen's Eagles, and a greater quantity of Assaborn infantry. Across the field on the northern arm of the Reich rode a division of Count Krugar's Telutan Red Scythe skirmishing cavalry, some of the most skilled horsemen in the entire empire. The Telutan ruler himself was not present, having dispatched the scythes from besieged Talheim. Instead, his troops were led by Leodan. At most, Sigmar's army, including civilians and 100 dwarves in reserve, numbered no more than 15,000. As far as a slavering mass of undead corpses, beasts and monstrosities can have order, Nagash's army did. To counter the highly mobile forces on Sigmar's right, Nagash concentrated his corpse-eater beasts and wolves on that side of the field, together with a unit of heavily armoured skeletal knights in reserve. It was led by Sigurd. The centre, spearheaded by Marcus, was almost solely made up of regular undead. Regular undead also comprised Nagash's right, together with a skeletal knight unit, and his secret weapon, the fallen hulking chaos champion Krell. The necromancer king himself was on a hill near the rear of his army. Although the Dwarven contingent and civilians stayed where they were, the frontline forces of mankind launched a charge along the entire front. A cold rain continuously soaked the battlefield, transforming the wet ground near the rivers into a quagmire. That didn't prevent the first impact. From Sigmar's left to his centre right, the first ranks of undead chaff caved with little resistance, allowing them to drive deep into Nagash's army. On the right, however, difficulties began almost immediately. Although inflicting harsh losses on the dead things opposing them, Assaborn chariots and infantry found themselves easy prey for the specially placed flesh-eaters and death wolves. The battle near the southern fork descended into a nightmarish, disorganized melee, just as the undead preferred. At the heart of the fight was Freya, whose great chariot shattered into splinters when it was attacked by a titanic wolf. The queen survived, and according to her, had never felt more alive. On the left, Leodan's red scythes drove deep into the undead ranks, but received a direct counterattack from both the heavily armoured corpse knights and Krell. Under vicious assault from this rampaging demigod of war, the Telutans suffered heavy casualties, dying 10 at a time from Krell's devastating axe blows. As it seemed as though the left flank would collapse, Alaric the Mad and his 100 dwarves marched into the fray, blowing Krell's head to pieces with a novel invention, the black powder cannon, stabilizing the area. As it seemed Queen Freya's Assaborns would collapse under a renewed Black Knight assault, a disgraced 12-year-old boy called Dagal, whose cowardice caused a prior defeat, personally led the ragtag civilians of Reikdorf into battle against the undead throng assailing Freya. His intervention there stabilized the right at the cost of many civilian lives, and also managed to push away Sigurd, who had been heavily injured in the desperate fight. In the center-right, Alfgeir duelled and eventually managed to slay Count Marcus, but was badly wounded in the process. The tenacity of his army allowed Sigmar to push onwards towards Nagash. His patience gone, Nagash called upon a burst of dreadful magic and resurrected the dead inside Reikdorf and on the battlefield. The army of mankind began to rout back to the city at this new terror, but Sigmar's advance had now reached the undead lord. At the same time, several thousand unexpected berserker reinforcements under Otwin and Sigmar's bodyguard Redwain arrived from Middenheim, slamming into the undead army from the north. The final battle began, and Sigmar, who once again wore the crown of sorcery on his head, attacked Nagash directly. The two colossi of war fought a great battle, but the Emperor then carelessly tossed the crown and swung Galmaraz down, aiming to shatter the malignant creation. The calculated maneuver worked like a charm. Nagash, rabidly obsessed with regaining the all-powerful artifact and the undeniable power within it, lurched forward and reached for the crown. In doing so, the necromancer rendered himself vulnerable and allowed Sigmar to instead bring Galmaraz down in a thunderous overarm blow which, powered by ancient runic arts, obliterated the Dark Sorcerer completely. In an instant, the animating force powering Nagash's armies fell away. They simply stopped. Victory had been won. In the battle's calm aftermath, forces from the west brought news that Marburg had survived. Its rightful Count Uldred, however, lay unfortunately dead. A month after Nagash's defeat on the River Reik, the wily Marius and Uldred's cunning sister Marika joined hands in marriage, uniting the Teutoni and Endel peoples. Sigmar personally blessed the union. However, rumours persisted that Uldred had fallen not to the undead, but to an opportunistic conspiracy between the newlyweds amid the chaos of Marburg's siege. After all, Nagash's assault had left Teutonsric a smoking ruin, and Marius needed greener pastures to call his own. Sigmar's Dwarven allies, including his friend Alaric the Mad, finally returned to their mountain homeland after years of service in Reikdorf. Sigmar's only remaining sword brother Wulfgard settled down with his Assaborn wife and children, splitting his time between the imperial capital and Three Hills. Freya, gravely injured by Sigurd during the battle, also returned to Three Hills to rebuild what had been lost. Finally, Sigmar sent a high priestess far, far to the east, bearing the crown of sorcery, so that the dread artifact might never be found by the wrong people again. And here is where our sources detailing the ancient life of Sigmar Heldenhammer come to an abrupt end. Scattered and potentially unreliable texts reveal that the first emperor may have ruled mankind in relative quiet for several further decades, punctuated only by another incursion from the forces of chaos 15 years after Nagash's defeat. We're just not sure. However, in around 50 imperial calendar, an elderly Sigmar awoke one day and left his empire, venturing to the World's Edge Mountains alone. He was never seen again. In his wake, the counts elected Cedric, whose first act was to institute the system of elector counts, setting the stage of imperial history for millennia to come. As the first emperor's life became a legend and then myth, his reputation grew greater and greater until Sigmar became revered as a god in his own right. Thank you for watching our series on the life and battles of Sigmar. The Wizards and Warriors channel will continue talking about Warhammer Fantasy and other fantasy, sci-fi, space opera and alternative history universes in the future, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to see what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. Your feedback is very important to us. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.